Bigfoot make a Kleenex dance? How does Bigfoot make a Kleenex dance? He puts a little boogie in it. All right. We know that Bigfoot has big feet. That's how it got named, right? But Bigfoot has a big nose. Why is that?
Because he has big fingers?
That's right, Dan, because he has big fingers. All right, jokes aside, I would like to present our esteemed speaker, Dr. Stepp. I first met Dr. Stepp, actually I first saw Dr. Stepp when I was at Humboldt State University, and he was teaching his meteorology course outside on the cement, beautiful sunny day, and he had his students, and they were clouds, and they were wind, and they were currents, and he was moving them all around, and there were these chalk lines, and it was such a wonderful, engaging professor on such a beautiful day. And I thought, that is an amazing thing. Dr. Stepp earned his Bachelor of Science degree in physics at Baldwin Wallace College, and then earned with cum laude, and then earned his doctorate in meteorology with a specialty in turbulent fluid dynamics, and has been a professor at Humboldt State from 1973 to 2012. Now, folks, that's 39 years. I'm not sure I would want to do something that even feels good for 39 years. But, and Dr. Stepp has also been an amateur Bigfoot researcher as well as a professor. He asked that all of us keep an open mind. We can be skeptical, but we should keep an open mind because, after all, a large percentage of you in the room, science has just shown this through DNA samples, we are 2 to 4% Neanderthal, which I just recently kind of found out, which kind of spooked me a little bit. So keep an open mind, be skeptical. If you don't wish to see the presentation, that's fine. Dr. Stepp will speak for about an hour, and then he'll take questions for about a half hour. And he said if you don't want to stay for the questions, that's fine. And one of the important things for me as part of a Grange is don't go away hungry. Be sure you get food. That's kind of the community that we live in here. So, Dr. Stepp, anything else I should bring up? No? Okay, so without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Richard Stepp.
So you mentioned Neanderthal, and for the longest amount of time, all the while that I was in school, the assumption was always made that for a while anyway, 40,000 years ago or so, there was Neanderthals and there were Homo sapiens coexisting. But now it's getting more complicated. There's a cave up in Siberia, called Minnesota Cave, where another kind of hominid DNA has been brought out that absolutely is not Neanderthal, it's not Homo sapiens, but it coexisted with them. So there were 3. And the Chinese have a thing called the Red Deer Cave that they claim had a 4th kind of hominid that was a human-type hominid, still existing perhaps as early as late as 12,000 years ago. And then, on an island called Flores, one of the Indonesian islands, this island is pretty much just north of Australia, came hobbit stuff. The 3-foot-tall excavation of about something like a dozen skeletons. It was first found in 2004. It was first put in a regular journal in 2008. And at first, science did what you'd expect. They just zoomed in and tried to say, well, it was a bunch of hydrocephalics or something, some kind of freaks. But there was no evidence of that. And they have DNA. And so in the end, I think it's pretty well accepted that Homo floresiensis is another one. And they were in existence about 12,000 years ago. And this guy, Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University, who's the only regular tenured biological science professor in the United States, willing to write books and articles about Bigfoot. He's an expert on the human gait, well, the hominid gait, on the foot structure, on the dermal patterns, all that. He, of course, has no chance to get any kind of funding for that kind of work. He and I have done some stuff together, and we'll talk about that. But I've been pushing him hard to at least do some things that are related to this wider problem, and yet are publishable. Because that's the only way that actual money is going to come into this. And he got interested in the Homo floresiensis thing. And apparently was talking to some scientists from the Australian National University and also 2 others from Canadian universities. And 4 of them did a little sort of tour down in the area and ran into tribespeople that said to them, when speaking about this is about the 3-foot-tall things. See, the article that was published in, I believe, Nature, didn't say one thing that was really the 600-pound gorilla in the room. And that is that there had been an oral tradition of these creatures for thousands of years, called Orient Pendek, or Sadapa. And the people there considered them in the oral tradition, considered them to be humans, considered them to have a language, but no way knew it. They used tools, they had arrows, better leave them alone. But what the natives said to Meldrum and his cohorts is, see that cave over there? Our ancestors killed the last of them 200 years ago. And see that mound? That's where they are. Well, now that would really be quite remarkable. And Meldrum, of course, gets a lot of flack from his colleagues in Iowa State. But one of them came up to him after the Floresiensis thing, saying, you know, if there could be a hominid line half the size of humans, still extant at least 12,000 years ago that we didn't know about, well then what the heck, maybe there could be another one twice as big as humans, you know? And he was almost saying it was a joke, because I'm sure that if he had to vote on it, he'd vote no. But at any rate, a little crack appeared in the, for Meldrum in the acceptance, although he pays a very heavy price for doing what he does. He will never, ever be an associate or a full professor. Even though he publishes plenty of articles on other stuff that isn't related to Bigfoot, but you know, he's taking it. And you know, I wasn't meaning to tell you this, but I think I'm going to tell you this. You might wonder what my connection with this is. Well, I met Meldrum at the Little Willow Creek, put on a scientific conference on Bigfoot. Can you imagine? And probably everybody who saw the announcement thought it was some kind of Bigfoot Days prank. But it wasn't. They had real people come in. Jane Goodall was invited, and she couldn't come, but she sent a letter to be read then. And the letter said roughly, this should be studied. It's high time. But I met Meldrum, and I asked him what he did for funding. And he just laughed. You know, I mean, there was no. Every now and then he'd get some little donations and this, that, and everything. And my peculiar circumstances are that I had a choice. And I'm telling you this partly because although it won't apply to most people here, it might apply to some. Especially younger people that one day will be my age. My folks were dying in the 90s, and I was going to get a pretty good chunk of cash because they were upper middle class and there were only 3 siblings. And I made an election to have about half of that go to a charity instead, but a charity that I would subsequently control. In other words, I couldn't give it to a private person, but I could tell that charity to give it to any IRS-recognized entity, like Idaho State University. And so I told Meldrum, I'll help you. And I didn't have millions, but he didn't have anything. And then just recently, he told me there's a catch-22 with this Floriensis stuff. Because the National Science Foundation says they will support us, but only after we get all the permissions, and basically can give them a proposal that includes talking to the local officials, talking to any local academic, getting everybody that has to say yes, getting them to say that, which means they've got to go over there several times. But where's the money for that? The National Science Foundation wouldn't do it, and so I did. And that wasn't huge; it was $9,000. So without having any noticeable credentials in biology, I can actually go in there and make a little difference. Now most people I have no kids. I don't have all the expenses most people have. I had no interest whatsoever in fancy things. You should see my truck. It's like it. But I did this. And people could do this. We are propagandized all the time into believing that it's almost patriotic to go buy a Jaguar if you can. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm simply saying, but there are other options. And I'm taking one of them, and maybe someone else here would be inspired at some point to do that. So, Bigfoot is a crackpot topic. And what I mean by that, I'm going to give you my definition of the word crackpot, which is if a substantial majority, large majority of the professionals in a field would call it a crackpot subject, then it's a crackpot subject. Now you have to realize that acupuncture and acupressure were absolutely crackpot when I moved to Humboldt in 1973, and now they're not. Does that mean that everything that's in the crackpot realm graduates? Oh no, it doesn't. There's plenty of stuff that belongs there. But it means some of those things can. And you have to understand what happens when something's in the crackpot realm. And here's what happens. When something's in the crackpot realm, if anyone talks about it in a positive kind of supportive way, like I am doing for Bigfoot, they are also a crackpot. And you have to consider the logic here. This now becomes circular. In other words, once you have that set of beliefs that the subject is crackpot and people who talk about it crackpot, well then no evidence could ever be presented that would break that. Don't, for instance, even think that if you found a dead Bigfoot, and of course they're rather big, so you probably couldn't carry it home, but maybe you could cut off a wrist if you weren't too worried about gore. But don't think you could go to Humboldt State and say, hey, I found this is really interesting. Would you test it? They might even take it, but it would end up in the trash. It becomes circular. How long can that circle last? Forever. So I want to give you an example of that on a different topic. In 1973, and I came in 73 to Humboldt. And at that time, I had some in-laws that lived in Utah. So we spent a lot of time going down to southern Utah looking at the pictographs of petroglyphs. Well, in 1973, there was a guy named Laban Martineau. And some of the names I give you are on the handout. Got a whole bunch of them here, wherever they went. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, if you want the handouts, there's a handout here. It's got every name that I'm going to give you tonight, just about. So Laban Martineau was not highly educated. He was an orphan and was adopted by Indians who lived on a reservation in Utah. And he went in the army and was trained as a code breaker. And And then he came back to the reservation. And he looked without the bias of anthropologists, if I may say so, at what he saw on the rocks. And, the anthropologists are going to tell you that it's hunting magic, it's clan symbols, it's the creation story, and those things are probably there. I have no doubt that they're there. But he was looking at everything. And he made a presumption that is just as reasonable as anything could possibly be. And that is, maybe what's written on the rocks in the southwest United States is related to the absolutely universal Indian Sign Language of North America. The languages of North America, Native Americans, are more varied than any place on earth. Amongst just the local tribes, there's some groups that have languages that are as different as, say, Hungarian is from French. Hungarian isn't even an Indo-European language. Hungarian and Estonian and Finnish are just a whole other thing. They're not related to the European family. But within our local Native American groups, there's groups that are that wide apart. And so all over North America, there was a sign language. And I have 3 or 4 books on it, but here's one. And so he said, maybe some of the stuff that's on the rocks is related to the sign language. All right, why not? And so he wrote this book, The Rocks Begin to Speak. It's still available on Amazon. He died, he published this in 73, and he died in the last few years. His daughter is trying to keep his ideas alive. I'm involved with a lady that runs the Jackson Hole, Wyoming Historical Society in the museum now. Dr. Sharon Can. And I'll tell you about my involvement with her, maybe if we get to it. And I asked her, the anthropologists you work with, what do they think about Martinet? And she said, oh, the one guy says that's been disproved. And I said, do you think he's even looked at the book? And she says, no, I don't think so. Well, so it was early in my career, maybe I don't know, 1977, something like that. And I contacted Martinet. And no one's going to take that hardback out on a backpack. It's too heavy. It's not really organized as a field guide. I asked him if I could rewrite it as a field guide with his permission, and he gave me permission, and I wrote a field guide. But I was working 70 hours a week, and I made a field guide for me and for a few friends, that had copies, but I never tried to publish it. I never really went there. And a relative of mine in southern Utah, in the middle of summer, was hiking a dry wash down in southern Utah and saw this set of symbols on the rock. And she had my guide. And she read in my guide that spiral came from the sign language, which is going up. And that thing above the spiral is a hand cut, which means drinking water. And that thing over it means covered over, hidden. So she read it as go up to hidden drinking water. And this was summer in the middle of Utah at 110 degrees. She climbed up out of the wash, discovered a 1,000-gallon pool under a big rock of rainwater. Now, what are the chances? I've been sort of threatened by kidney disease my whole life, so I'm a little bit unusual in the sense that I don't automatically assume that I'm going to live as long as normal. Now probably I am because I figured out what caused my kidney disease, but at least for most of my life I haven't thought in those terms. And so one regret I would have if I didn't wake up tomorrow would be that I didn't get and find that thing, because I don't know exactly where it is. I know the canyon, but the canyon's rather big. I'd like to find that petroglyph. I'd like to do it with an anthropologist with me. and then have them have my guide, them read the thing, them climb up, them discover the pool, and write it up. You know, I think that might break the crackpot circle, because Levon Martineau is a crackpot. And published in 1973, and to this day, nobody accepts any of his work, despite the fact that he had all kinds of reasonable little stuff like this. I was walking along in southern Utah, I saw a spiral on an absolutely sheer 50-foot tall rock face. No way you could ever go up. And I saw this spiral. But I looked up. And then I saw a petroglyph way up there underneath an overhang that I never would have seen if it hadn't been for that spiral. That's the kind of thing that Martineau did. Now, my point in telling you about that is just to say you have a concept that science pretty much goes out there and studies pretty much anything. And I'm telling you, oh, no, it doesn't. There is no scientific method if you're a scientist for deciding what to study. It's up to you. And you can make all kinds of skepticism noises to make it look like you're just a scientist that is easily fooled and you've got to see proof and this and that and the other thing, but it might just be because you don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so what do scientists study? If they're employed, they study what their bosses approve of. And if they're in a university, they study what granting agencies, well, they not only study what their bosses approve of, they study what granting agencies are willing to fund. And if they're not willing to fund something, they don't study it. And for how long? Forever. There's no getting out of that. And so I'm showing you this example just because here's something that's crying out to be investigated. But it hasn't been. And there's no real reason to think that it's ever going to be. But now a few more of you know, and so there's at least a chance. Okay. When I came to Humboldt, you know, I'm a very serious athlete, and I told them I'm going to spend probably half of my waking hours working on my athletics, and they said, we don't care as long as your teaching goes well. Nowadays, they have research into that, and probably actually I would have part of the company. I was sort of a research hotshot, but I came here because I didn't want to do that anymore. Well, anyway, so I got to explain to you a little bit why I'm going to talk about Bigfoot. So we've got to start with how I began my life in crime. When I was a little kid, I grew up along Lake Erie, and I was a boat person. I built a really nice sailboat when I was 13. On mahogany. And I read about the Vikings, and then I learned in school that Columbus discovered America, and there was no the Vikings went along the way northern route, and they very likely at least came to America, but other than that, there were no crossings of the Atlantic. Let me show you something. You might say to yourself, well, that's probably not entirely true. But what I'm saying to you is it's ridiculous. This is a slide of much of the Pacific Ocean. And is there anything I can use for a pointer? What's that? Well, oh, is that a little like lasers? Oh, well, let me just, here, I'll use a snowshoe. There's Hawaii. Hawaii is 2,400 miles from the coast of California. 2,400 miles is almost the distance across the Atlantic. Hawaii was absolutely settled by 300 AD. Pigs, chickens, and families. It was surely discovered much before that. 300 AD is 1,200 years before Columbus. Every other little island in the whole Pacific that was ever settled by anyone was settled by 800 years ago, which is to say 300 years before Columbus. What kind of boats did they use? They looked like that. So then, we look at the Atlantic. And we're told that nobody ever went across that. There's a Native American guy, Jack Forbes, professor at UC Davis. He's probably not a professor there anymore. But he wrote a book called The American Discovery of Europe. And what he argued was that if you go from southern Norway over to the Shetland Islands, it's only something like 150 miles, maybe another 150 to the Faroes, 275 from the Faroes to Iceland, 225 from Iceland to the coast of Greenland, then you go along the edges of Greenland to where they put a colony in the year 980. There's no doubt about that. There was a colony there in 980. And it's 125 miles at the closest spot over to Labrador. They could have gone there for the weekend. And what Forbes argued is there were thousands of back and forths up there. And there's a Harvard professor, full professor at Harvard in biology, who studied the movement of plants and animals around the earth and how they got there, whether they were carried by people, whether they carried by ocean currents, or whatever. He grew up, his family was Irish, Irish Gaelic, so he spoke Gaelic, and he also had a good background in Latin and Greek. And so he went around in his research and more ran into evidence that there could have been cross-ocean transport. Like right in here somewhere, he said there's gravestones written in Latin, which is not an unknown language, that say, here lies so-and-so, who as a young man crossed the ocean to the great forested continent and only came back in his latter years, or something of that kind. Does anybody believe Feld? No, he's a crackpot. He's full professor at Harvard and all that, but it's not okay to speak about cross-Atlantic voyages. In 1954, a French guy pushed off in a little life raft with a sail, a doctor named Alain Bogart, and crossed the Atlantic and ended up in here somewhere with no food and no water. He wanted to prove that you can do it. You can drink seawater if you don't drink any more than a quart a day. You never, ever go beyond that, and your kidneys can handle it. And then he dragged a net to pick up plankton, and every now and then he'd catch a fish. And he made it across in something like, I don't know, 54 days. In Columbus's own writing, there was a story by him in a book that was his, that's in a museum in Italy, that when he was a younger man, not the captain of a ship, but on a ship, he went up to Galway Bay in Ireland and saw people he called Indians that had come across the ocean on a log, he said, but it was a dugout. Galway Bay, it turns out, is so used to getting driftwood from this area, that they even have block and tackle set up, the people who live along the beach, because they don't have many trees there, and if they have a great big tree floating up, they can pull it up onto the property. What I'm suggesting to you is there could have been major back and forth. But that's considered crackpot. And I do have a little bit of anthropological background because in college, I saw this ad in the paper that Case Institute in Cleveland was running some Native American digs in Northwest Ohio, and students were asked to apply. And so I called up this guy and spoke to him. It was pretty obvious right away that he wanted anthropology students. He didn't want some physics major. And I was talking to him, and it looked like, I mean, I knew the answer. The answer was pretty dumb. But then I said this to him. I said, well, okay, but you know, I don't collect anything and I can dig in the hot sun. And there was this silence on the end of the line. And the guy said, all right, you're on. And this guy's name is Owen Lovejoy, who is now one of the most famous anthropologists in the world. So, and Owen and I were sitting around campfire. He was maybe 2 years older. And at one point I asked him, if I find some copper armor, what do I do? And this was his PhD thesis. He said to me, you put it back in, don't tell me. This would have destroyed it. There's not supposed to be copper armor in Native American days. And stuff like that. So, you see, this is a little bit of background. I was a grad student at Penn State, and there came this time when we all went to Friday seminar. And some professor, retired physics professor from Texas, was giving a talk on what electric or magnetic field would be required to stop an electron flowing in a copper wire at a distance of a half a mile. Now, this is not exactly anything that any of you probably have been thinking about. And he laughingly said that the reason he thought of this is that there had been a UFO sighting in Texas. And the people that had been there said that everywhere within a half a mile radius, cars stalled and even tractors out in the field. They said, I'm not saying this actually happened, I don't know, I have no idea, but I thought it was an interesting physics problem to go and then take what we do know about physics and copper wires and see if we can come up with whether this is plausible or whether it's beyond anything that we know. And so he started giving his talk, and I was as qualified as anybody there in the room to listen to it. And my professors were there, who I very much respected as good scientists, and my graduate student peers. And after a while, I got a sense of something funny was going on. And I didn't know what it was. It was just a different energy. And then I figured out they were laughing at him. They were making fun of him. And I thought, oh my God. Science, all these scientists that I'm working with, they aren't as open-minded as I thought. I mean, this guy it's not okay for a physicist to talk about UFOs. Even if he avowed at the start that he wasn't in any way saying this actually happened. It just wasn't okay. And I went back after that and thought, wow, just think of how many really interesting things are going to be out there that science has simply turned away from and not looked. You know, back in the 1600s, there was a guy named Mendel that did some little stuff with peas and came up with some genetic rules. Well, my biologists, I'm sure every one of them wish that somehow they could be back in that time and maybe they could do a discovery like that, and then instead of being a member of a 50-person team working at Lawrence Livermore or something. But maybe they could, because maybe there's some subjects that science will not look at. Linnaeus, the guy that made up the system for classifying plants and animals, well, he had a Homo troglodytes in his book, a hair-covered, human-sized thing that lived in the forest and was dangerous to people. What are you going to do with that? Well, they do nothing. They just assume that Linnaeus, however much he might have been a pretty good scientist in terms of the descriptions of everything else he did, they probably figured that he got that from an old wives' tale. There's a guy named Steller, a German naturalist in the late 1700s, named Steller's J, for instance. Well, he also named Steller's sea. And he described being offshore the coast of either Northwest Territories or Alaska, I forget exactly where it was, and having a bigger than human-sized ape swim around his boat for a half an hour, and they were 2 miles off the coast, off the beach. And he did a sketch, I think, of it. Well, it goes nowhere, despite that he was a big name. After that physics lecture, I got interested in UFOs, of course. I read the whole summer. And you're going to find, with crackpot subjects, there will be crackpots. Make no mistake about it. There also will be hoaxers. They are attracted to those subjects. And of course, they make it much worse in terms of any real scientist trying to sort it out. But when you read about UFOs, every now and then you get one that says, oh my God. You know, there were UFOs over Washington, D.C. at one point that were on the radar, based on the ground. They scrambled jets. The pilots could see them visually. The pilots had radar. They could see them on radar. And the pilots went after them with their jets, which could go as fast as any jet in the world at the time. And the things just went away at 20,000 miles an hour. What are you going to do with that? The military, every now and then I have a student who's in the military, and they come after, I talk about things like this only occasionally. The students get it now. And they come up to me afterwards and say, I was in this and that branch. And yes, they take this very seriously. But then at the end of that summer, HSU called me and they actually said that they gave me this job because I had a degree in meteorology and nobody else had applied for their job did. They had 300 applicants. And they said, you want to come and teach at Humboldt over the summer? They figured I'd start in graduate. And I said, no, I'm on the mountains in Peru. I'll see you in September. And so I drove out here in September. And then right away, I discovered that you had your own crackpot phenomenon here. And I figured, well, it doesn't make any sense for me to keep reading on UFOs. I should start reading on that one. And I was aware that if I were a biologist, this would be a really bad idea. And it would have truncated my career. But as a physicist, nobody cared. They expect physicists to be a little weird. And so I could do it. And so, in all that reading, well, I've learned a lot. I'm going to tell you some of the stuff I've learned. I had a lot of personal stories told to me, and then I had to make a judgment about, do I believe this person? And believe has two components. First, is the person lying or not? And secondly, have they been fooled? But in lots of cases, my conclusion is, I believe what they're telling me. You should understand there's a mythology in this area that Humboldt invented Bigfoot. It's possible that Time Standard guy coined the term. Very likely. But Bigfoot is a worldwide phenomenon. And it's not just really big ones. There's at least 4 different hominid sizes. In Europe, especially in southern part of what would be Soviet Union, there's the almasti or almas, and they're human size. And the Russians, who have written thousands of papers and several books, including some books that I bought, all of those books are in English, think they are Neanderthals. And are very protective. The villagers in the Caucasus Mountains are very protective of them. They do not want scientists to come in and try to take a sample. So, what authority do I have to speak about this subject? I've taught biophysics now for about 20 years, but I tell the students in the first day, every one of you has more biological knowledge than I do. But I know some physics about this biology that I'm going to give you, and your job is to listen to that and then biologically criticize it. And over the 20 years, I've learned a lot. So in certain categories, I know some biology. But I have no way to prove anything. But the authority I'm going to bring you is these books. And if some of you are biologists, then you need, if you're interested, to check out some of these titles, Google them or something. And these books are written by people with PhDs in zoology or physical anthropology, and who conclude that these things exist and give you lots of descriptions. This guy, John Napier, this book looks like it ought to be next to the National Enquirer at supermarket. But this guy was the head of the Smithsonian Institute Primate Program when he wrote this book. And his conclusions are, it couldn't be hoaxed unless every one of the people describing this thing are lying. But could someone do this and trick them? No. No, and you'll see why. Here's a guy, Dr. John Bindernagel, who was a Canadian wildlife biologist, PhD from a U.S. university, who after 25 years of doing contract work for the Canadian government retired and then said, all right, I'm going to come out of the closet now. These things exist. And he wrote a book comparing their behavior to the great apes of Africa. There's a lot of drumming on wood and throwing of pine cones and all kinds of intimidating behavior. Vocalizations are part of this thing too. Here's a couple of Russian books. One of the ladies from the Anthropological Institute in St. Petersburg is an MD. And she was present at the body of one of these things, but absolutely not permitted to take a sample of any kind. You can imagine, well, I'll tell you another one. I'm not going to give you much names here, but Bigfoot probably are not dangerous, usually. There's a Teddy Roosevelt story when he was camping up in the Sierras, and his guide told a Bigfoot story about a situation that was dangerous. But there's an Indian reservation in Utah, in Idaho, where some of the tribal high-ranking people told Meldrum and Lansinski, the two guys I work with, that a girl had been abducted, a 13-year-old, and she later was found. I guess, exactly how she got away, probably not, but she was found, and she was pregnant, and she gave birth to a child that lived until the child was 11. And they know where, they actually didn't stay in Idaho, they moved. They know where they went and they know where the child is buried. But don't assume that that's going to mean that someone digs up this child. There's lots and lots of barriers here, and maybe there should be. And so for the villagers in the Caucasus Mountains simply not wanting a bunch of government scientists to come and mess with their mascots, essentially, is not that surprising. This book is by a guy named Grover Krantz, PhD in physical anthropology. He's now dead. He was a professor at Washington State University. He also never made full professor because he wrote about Sasquatch. He describes a 4-mile-long track that a Sasquatch left in the snow. It was an absolutely perfect anatomical clubfoot. Turned over and like so for 4 miles, and with a stride length that no human can match. You can do anything you want with making a great big footprint. But you can't change your stride length. And if you have those big things on your feet, you're actually going to shorten your stride length. You couldn't even step in such a way that the back of the one is in front of the other. And how are you going to explain a set of tracks that go miles that are way more, like 8 feet? Now, in 1967, there were a huge bunch of sightings inland from here. And Hummel was, of course, asked to go out there. But the guy who was the tech, the stockroom tech at the physics department, was the only person from Hummel State that was willing to go out there and really look at the tracks. And he said that when they went along the road, he could imagine that maybe if a person had a right foot on the end of a pole, a left foot on the end, and sat on the back of a truck, they'd go hit, 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 hit. Now, what he didn't know is that footprints in anything other than the hardest surfaces are actually fairly complicated, with little pressure ridges and little details that only an expert would know. And an expert would cover it. But it might take an hour to make a really good print. And so what about thousands? But he thought that a person could just go along the road. But then I told him, yeah, but if you actually study that sighting, you'll see where there's been reports of those tracks going up the embankment. That's a whole different game. Once it goes up the embankment, you don't have the choice of whatever stride length you want. Has a book about the Ray Wallace incident, which is the local thing. Ray Wallace apparently had a contract to build a GO road. Gaston or Orleans. And the way those contracts work is that they've got to get that road built by a certain day or they're in big economic trouble. And he was going along fine, but then apparently there started being Bigfoot scares up on his job site. Trailers were being rocked in the night and full oil drums were being picked up and tossed down in ditches and stuff like that. Not to say that that's beyond any human to do, but it's getting out there. And so it's argued that Ray Wallace tried to show that this was all hoax. So he made some plywood feet and tried to convince his workers that, see, it was just me. And then when he died, something like 5-6 years ago, his family found these big teeth in the garage. And the Times Standard shot in there and interviewed him. And then the Times Standard really showed their ignorance. Because they just wrote, it's over, Bigfoot is solved. They didn't know it was a worldwide phenomenon. They didn't, for instance, compare the shape of these feet to the shape of the castings that were taken out there with plaster. They weren't the same. There was simply, there was no reason to reach the conclusion they reached. But everybody wanted it that way. And it made the Associated Press writers. Bigfoot's, it's done, we got it. Well, anyway, there's a whole chapter in this book about it by Jeff Meldrum. But there's a lot of chapters in here about the footprints and about the footprint evidence. There was at some conference in Willow Creek, there was a guy who worked at a police department in Texas, and he was sort of the United States' biggest expert on fingerprints and footprints, bare footprints. And he was allowed into Meldrum's lab and to study decades and decades of plaster casts that were taken. And he spent like 3 days looking at these. And he simply said, folks, I'm not a biologist. Don't ask me what they eat. Don't ask me any questions like that. But I looked at those dermal patterns. When there's a wound on a bare foot, like there always is going to be in anything that runs around barefoot, there are certain ways that the healing takes place, certain ways that the dermal patterns line up. He said they're perfect. And he said a lot of that stuff wasn't even known in 1958 when some of those prints were taken. He said, I could have faked them, but probably nobody else could. He said, you got a real animal running around out there. I don't know what it eats. I don't know anything about it, but there's your problem. This guy, John Napier, the Smithsonian Institute Primate Program guy, he just couldn't get over the fact that the great apes in Africa were vegetarians. Actually, they're not as vegetarian as they thought they were. But he couldn't get over that. And then how could something the size of Bigfoot live in the Northwest forest that doesn't have enough vegetable matter down there? Well, the answer is very simple. They're not vegetarians. They would have to be omnivores because bears are about as big as they are and they live there. And there's just zillions of reports of these things taking fish off drying racks, catching fish in streams. Even one case of a guy watching a Bigfoot scooping up the scree of a scree pile coming off a mountain and digging in and taking out hibernating marmots and just eating them. So apparently, if they're there, they're omnivores. Has there ever been an animal like Bigfoot? You bet. Here's a Scientific American article called Gigantopithecus. Scientific American, it's not a crackpot publication. They don't have a heck of a lot of a body, I think they really only got part of a skull and a jaw and a few teeth, but the anthropologists are clever guys, and they decided that this had to be a 10-foot tall ape, and it's accepted enough to be in scientific literature. And here's a whole book about Gigantopithecus by a professor in Iowa, and he's very careful to tell you that he wants nothing to do with Bigfoot. Why? Well, he has a career. There was a conference at University of Vancouver in British Columbia back in the 70s called Man-Like Monsters on Trial. And most of it's just sort of unbearably boring. But there are a few articles in here that talk about some people that went to the Balkan Peninsula in the 70s and interviewed the oldest people they could find about their memories of their grandparents. And so that got them back to about 1816 or so. And this group kept hearing that in those days, the forest people worked on the farms. And who were the forest people? They were air-covered, they did not speak, they could communicate by hand signals, they could carry water, they could herd sheep, they could do farm tasks, and they could mate with humans. And in the then Soviet Union, there was one forest person woman named Zana, Z-A-N-A, which if you Wikipedia, you'd find the story. But that's not where I got the story. I got it in many, many other places for Wikipedia. She had a son who seemed to be normal human in every way, except he was much stronger than the average person. And he was autopsied when he died. And one group of Russian doctors said he was just fully human. One group said there were structures in his skull which are not. But there's a bunch of evidence that's really that's testable. But the problem is, it's right on the edge of a crackpot subject. And so you'd have to think a little bit about if you're an up-and-coming anthropologist, do you really want to get involved in this stuff? A guy named Bernard Heuvelmans, zoology PhD, Belgian, wrote a book in French in 1954 called On the Track of Unknown Animals. And he started the field that has become called cryptozoology. And you can read about what people thought about certain animals that weren't considered to exist before they were discovered. He said the mountain gorilla was perfectly well described by Arab slave traders in the 60s and 80s and was not accepted by scientists until Henry Stanley in the early 1900s. There's a lot in this book, a lot of different animals. But what we discover is this Bigfoot thing isn't that different. It's only different because things like us are a lot touchier than some cat. But here's a question. Well, I already told you, Mayan Sinski was a game warden and was told he'd be fired if he reported an ape. Well, Mayan Sinski, 2 years ago, was asked by the Yellowstone Rangers to give a talk on Bigfoot. And he came back and did it. And within weeks, the Yellowstone Rangers were reporting Bigfoot sightings. Well, it's overwhelmingly possible that they had been seeing these things forever, but now it was okay. Mayan Sinski works with a woman whose family owns a whole little stream valley. It's a stream that goes down to a major valley in the Wind Rivers, but this particular family owns all the land in that watershed and has a fence across at the bottom. And this lady, I think she's in her 50s, just said, all my growing up, we always knew that the apes were up there, and we were told to be careful, and we didn't go up there, and certainly we didn't go up there alone, and things like that. And Mayan Sinski is convinced that expeditions don't work. They're too noisy. Time and time again, what happens is people go into an area, with a bunch of people where there's been a lot of sightings. And maybe in the first 12 hours, there's some vocalizations, there's some tracks, then there's nothing. And after enough of those experiences, it gets through to people that maybe this isn't the best way to do it. Wyszynski is sort of a magical character. He's a couple years younger than me. And unlike me, he's tall and handsome. And he plays music. And he goes out into the woods and just plays a flute. And he's seen a lot. But here's a story for you. I was in an expedition with Meldrum and Wyszynski in the year 2005, August, about 70 miles from Seattle, Washington, but in a very rural, wooded area next to a river called the Suaves. And we were in this place. And a guy shows up in a state of Washington pickup truck. And he gets out, he's this really dapper ranger character with pressed uniform, about 60 years old. And he's cordial, but sort of wary. And after a while, we get what's going on here. He wants to know if we're a bunch of crazies with AK-47s looking to see if we can get $1 million. And once he decided that that wasn't the case, then he started talking. And he said, I'm going to tell you some things. It turned out he is Dr. Briggs Hall. His name is on the handout. Doctor of veterinary medicine. He was the lead veterinarian of the state of Washington Fish and Game. He was the supervisor of the veterinarian. And he said, I'm going to tell you some things. He said, my biologists walk the borders of the state of parks in the state of Washington, and they have seen a lot. But nothing I tell you may you repeat until I retire in December of this year. And then I'm going to join the search. And he told he said, if a bear kills an elk, it's just a huge mess. And if a cougar kills an elk, you'll see it lying there and you think maybe it's sleeping. You'd have to actually mess around until you find the incision. But he said, two of my biologists found an elk that had been killed by having his head twisted off. And a huge scat pile, which they took, sent it to a lab. And the lab calls them the next day and said, what did you send us? And he laughingly said to the lab, that's what we send to the lab for. But they said, we have never seen anything like this. We do not know what it is. It seems to be primate. That's it. End. So there, and he had other stories, but not as clear as that one. People will ask, well, geez, why aren't there bones? And it took me several years before just recently I realized, let's turn that question around. How about, has there ever been an animal that wasn't thought to exist and then was found? And was found because someone found bones. And I asked that of Wyszynski and Meldrum, and Wyszynski said, I don't think so. And like, for instance, the coelacanth was this fish that was supposed to be extinct for 170 million years, and then they found it in a Madagascar fish market. And there turned out to be several populations of them around the world. So scientists missed that one. Well, now, it's in the water, so it's not quite the same as land. But wouldn't you imagine that every now and then a coelacanth would have ended up on a beach somewhere? For 100 years? Why didn't anybody look at this fish and say, hey, that looks sort of different. I'm going to check with my local, wildlife specialist or something. But it didn't happen. And it didn't happen in any other animal anyone knows. But then Meldrum said, actually, there is a case. He said there was a missionary in Gabon, in Africa, in the 1830s, who was sick for a while and couldn't leave. And apparently, according to his story, saw the skull of a lowland gorilla. And therefore went searching once he was healthy enough and then found it. But he said that's the only case he knows. Now, what happens to bones? If you go out in the woods, you're going to see bones every now and then. But almost without exception, it's going to be some animal that is a prey animal. It's going to be a deer. Among big animals, it's going to be a deer, or it could be a sheep, it could be a cow. If it's a bear or a cougar, and there's lots of them out there, it would either have to be roadkill or be shot. What do those animals do? For one thing, those animals don't go down because someone kills them, other than a shot. They go down because they get sick or an infection or something, and they crawl into some place and hide and die there. And then what happens? Within weeks, the bones are eaten. Porcupines eat them. What happens if these things die out in the desert somewhere? The bones might be there, but they don't live there in the desert. So the argument about bones, now mind you, there are people that argue they have seen huge bones. But it's in the crackpot realm, so it's not like there was a stampede to go find these. And then a very standard argument is wildlife biologists would see these things if they were there. To which I say, well, apparently some of them do, because a bunch of those books I showed you are wildlife biologists. Melger is a wildlife biologist. Bitternagel is a wildlife biologist. And Briggs Hall is not exactly a wildlife biologist, but he's a veterinary specialist, specializes in disease of like white sheep or something. There have been a bunch of calls in recent years for this to be investigated. In 2006, Jane Goodall. In 2006, Dr. George Schauer of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And in 2004, the guy who was the editor of Nature magazine, you know, the big scientific journal, Henry Dee, wrote a little editorial and said, it's about time we really looked into this. But the crackpot realm is powerful. And so, there you go. And I think maybe what I ought to do at this point is just shut up and say, this is the end, and now you can ask me questions until midnight. Okay?